Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Niles Barnes, Deputy Director of the East Coast Greenway Alliance, and it is my privilege to welcome you to our Greenway Criteria and Design Guide webinar. The vision of the East Coast Greenway, as many of you know, is a 3,000-mile continuous protected route for cyclists, walkers, runners, skaters, wheelchair users, and more, stretching from the main border with Canada all the way to Key West, Florida. And currently, over one-third of the route is on protected facilities, with the remaining sections routed on the safest on-road connectors. So today's webinar is to share more background on where and how the Greenway is built, and to dig into some of the details as it relates to the design of facilities that can be included into the Greenway network. We aim for this webinar and the guide to be useful for government agency staff, consultants, and citizen advocates who, together with the Alliance, are making the Greenway a reality, segment by segment, piece by piece. And we're excited for the progress that is happening throughout the 15-state corridor and excited to help accelerate that development. The scope of this webinar will not go into depth on the process of formal designation or funding the Greenway, but be on the lookout for future webinars and resources that are going to focus on those specific topics in more depth. And also a reminder that we are always seeking new volunteers and support from people that want to get involved in the Greenway. So I'd encourage anyone to reach out to us at any time, and we'll be happy to get you plugged into the work. The Greenway Criteria and Design Guide we are presenting today is an update and a revamp from earlier versions. It was written by the staff of the Alliance and did receive input and feedback from partners at the federal, state, local, and regional levels. So with that, I'd like to introduce our presenters and just want to do a little bit of webinar housekeeping. All attendees' lines have been muted, and you can open and close your control panel by clicking on the little orange box with the arrow. And we'd ask if you could please submit questions via the questions panel and be sure to send them to the organizers and panelists. Today's presentation is being recorded, and we're going to upload it to the East Coast Greenway YouTube account in the next couple of days. So presenting on today's webinar is an all-star cast of leaders from the Alliance. Christine Keeney is based outside of Portland, Maine. Bruce Donald's located in Farmington, Connecticut. Daniel Pascal is our Mid-Atlantic coordinator based in Philadelphia. Sarah Sanford covers Virginia and North Carolina and is based here in Durham. Brent Bice is based in Savannah. And last but certainly not least, V. Christensen is our Florida leader based in Jacksonville. So we are keeping the presentation overall fairly short so we can maximize time for questions. So without any further ado, I will pass the microphone to Sarah and V.
All right. Hi, everyone. This is Sarah, Virginia and North Carolina coordinator. I'm just going to briefly go over where the Greenway is built. So for all of you who've been on the Greenway, you probably already know that the East Coast Greenway is built in a wide variety of contexts and rights-of-way. So these can include existing right-of-ways on urban and suburban streets, side paths adjacent to highways, abandoned rail corridors, sometimes active rail corridors, along riverbanks or canal banks, and even along disused Forest Service roads. So in the pictures here, you can see some of these examples. In the top photo, we see a side path adjacent to the road. Below that is the Rails to Trails project, that is the American Tobacco Trail here in Durham. In the middle photo, the Greenway along the Hudson River, and on the far left, the Greenway along an existing sewer easement. So these are some of the places where the Greenway is built, and I'm going to pass it over to V to tell us how the Greenway is built.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. This is V in Florida, here to chat a little bit about how the Greenway is built. Now, Greenway segments are constructed, as Sarah mentioned, with a variety of funding sources due to the differences in the contexts as well. So here we've included some examples that are also seen in the guide. But before I go into that, we have had multiple questions around funding come in. So as Niall mentioned, we know there's a separate need for guidance around that. but this webinar will not go into additional detail. We do expect to have a future webinar on funding the Greenway. Now, here are 4 examples of the Greenway being built in different geographic locations and with different contexts. Now we have examples of South Carolina, Connecticut, Philadelphia, and Florida. Now, with examples of frequently used funding sources, as you can see, they coordinate on with these locations. Now, I'd like to just point out that this is obviously just different wherever you are. So the availability of funding sources will differ state to state. But some of the examples that we have include Florida SunTrail funding source, as well as the Federal Transportation Alternatives Program, a funding source for transportation alternatives that includes on and off-road pedestrian and bicycle facilities, as well as recreational trail program projects. Now, in the guide, you'll actually also find a link to Federal Highway Resource on additional pedestrian and bicycle funding opportunities. And you can check that out for more information. Now I'm going to kick it back to Sarah to take us down the glossary for helpful terminology.
To understand how we design the East Coast Greenway, it's really important to understand the terminology first. So at the back of our design guide on page 31 is a glossary and definition section. And this is split into East Coast Greenway specific usage and then an additional glossary and acronyms. We have this East Coast Greenway specific usage section because our terminology and our definitions might be very different from a different trail or greenway organization. So for example, you'll see that we don't really use the term alternate route. We use the term complementary route. And then there's a definition right there below that you can check out. So this is important to look at before you really get into a project, because there's going to be words that we use that you might think of differently. And then the additional glossary and terms is just pretty basic definitions. The other important part about the terminology is that we have the glossary as its own standalone web page. So you can go to greenway.org/design-guide/glossary, and the entire glossary acronyms and specific usage is its own web page. So I would highly recommend that you bookmark that on your internet browser so that whenever you're working on any type of East Coast Greenway project, you can easily just click over to that and look up any terms that you don't recognize. So speaking of Greenway terminology, I'm now going to pass it on to Christine to talk about surface, width, and grades.
Hi, everyone. This is Christine coming at you from Maine. I am going to, as Sarah said, I'm going to talk to you about surface, width, and grade of building the East Coast Greenway, some important criteria, considerations that you might want to consider when you're deciding how to build the trail, what the width should be, what surface that you want to utilize. So in terms of the surface, the most important thing that you want to consider is that it's easily navigable by all users. You want to have the trail that you're going to build to be accessible to people with disabilities as well. And the basic definition of that is that the surface is firm and stable. Also, when you're trying to decide what surface that you want to use, you should also think about what the anticipated user volumes of your trail is going to be, what types of users you would like to have on that trail, and then as well as the geographic context in which you're going to build that trail. We're following this slide, we're going to go through the 4 different categories of surface types. Those include asphalt, concrete, crushed stone, natural surface trails, as well as boardwalk. And the picture on the right is of the East Bay Bike Path in Providence, Rhode Island. If you haven't been, you can see that it's beautiful. So highly recommend taking a trip there on the Greenway. Also have included it as a really great example of an asphalt trail. The surface there's no cracks in the surface. They keep up with the paving. You can also see that there's some striping there that helps users figure out which side of the trail they're supposed to be on, and they've even got some fog lines there so people know where the edge of the trail is as well. So in addition to all of the other considerations when you're deciding what surface to use for your trail, one of the most important ones is going to be the cost. So this slide here shows the material investment per mile to help you think about what those costs per mile will be of your trail. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see an asterisk. This is really important. The design and construction prices vary by region. We have 15 different states along the East Coast Greenway route, and the construction material costs and labor costs vary widely between Maine, New York, Florida, Georgia. So just keep that in mind as we go through this. We've broken down the material investment per mile into 3 different categories. The first one is less expensive, so 150 to 350,000 per mile. I will stress that this is on the very, very, very low end of the projects that we're seeing in terms of costs. This would be a project that involves minimal excavation, construction work, minimal drainage, minimal culverts, anything like that. This would be if you have a very defined corridor that just needs a minimal amount of excavation, some new surface material, maybe some striping at the crossings, things like that. Very, very less expensive. The next category is moderately expensive, $350,000 to $750,000 per mile. Again, this is, even though it's in the moderately expensive category, I would say that this is still on the lower end of the projects that we're seeing. This, again, would be similar to the less expensive category, but maybe you have some drainage work that needs to be done, maybe a couple small culverts, but nothing more than that. And lastly, the more expensive category, $750,000 to $1.5 million. I will stress that this is generally what we're seeing as a per mile cost. So definitely take that into consideration when you're looking at trying to estimate what your project might cost. This would be a trail project that involves more in-depth construction, excavation, maybe some engineering challenges, definitely a culvert or 2, and maybe even a bridge. If you add 2 bridges, then you're probably going to be above even the $1.5 million per mile. So I just wanted to give you a range to consider as you're moving forward with your projects. So next I'm going to go through those different categories of surface materials. The first one is asphalt. In terms of accessibility, asphalt is definitely preferred. It's firm and stable, easy to traverse for all types of users, people with disabilities, that sort of thing. It's especially good for if you anticipate having bicycle commuters. It's a really great surface for people to be able to bike easily and fairly quickly to places that they need to go if they're trying to get to work or something. Asphalt's also a great surface if you would like to have people to be able to skateboard or rollerblade, or people to be able to push strollers along it. It's very consistent. It's a very consistent surface. Asphalt lasts for a pretty long time. The biggest maintenance consideration often is there can be some drainage problems that pop up if they're not addressed during the initial construction. A lot of times what we'll see with asphalt trails is roots that are rising up underneath the surface and causing some cracking issues. So you want to think about that when you're building a trail and how far back that you want to cut the vegetation. And in this iteration of the design guide, we wanted to make sure that we had a lot of specifications and that we had best practices. So you can find much more detail in the design guide related to the type of aggregate, the type of drainage, and compaction that you need to build a really high quality asphalt trail. So next we're going to talk about concrete. Again, concrete is a really firm and stable surface, so it's really great for accessibility. The types of users that would utilize a concrete trail would be very similar to asphalt, but the only consideration would be folks that want to rollerblade or skateboard or even push a stroller. The seams in between the concrete can be a little bit more challenging. Concrete is definitely more expensive up front, but it has a really long lifespan. So that's really something that you want to consider for your project, is what is the upfront cost, but then also what is the ongoing maintenance cost. Concrete doesn't have a lot of maintenance associated with it, and it's actually especially good for flood-prone areas. I've included on the right-hand side of the slide a picture of the Harbor Walk in New Bedford, Massachusetts. This trail, concrete trail, is actually built on top of a hurricane barrier. which just demonstrates how great of a surface it is for areas that do anticipate some pretty intense flooding. It's also a great example of utilizing an infrastructure project like a hurricane barrier to add a trail. So now there's biking and walking there, and it also provides access to people to be able to see the ocean that otherwise would have physically been blocked by the hurricane barrier. So just something to consider when you have other infrastructure projects going on, or if you had flood prone areas that you're dealing with. So crushed stone or natural surface trails, in terms of accessibility, it isn't preferred because it can be a little bit difficult for people in wheelchairs or with mobility issues to go over the surface. But if it is firm and stable, then it is ADA accessible. This surface is also not ideal for commuting cyclists, and it's a little bit better for if you're a recreational touring cyclist. But however, it is actually great for walkers and runners, as it's a little bit easier on the knees. And then it's also great for equestrians if you're looking to accommodate that type of user on your trail. In terms of cost, crushed stone trails are definitely less upfront, but they do require more maintenance. They do require some grading. There might be some drainage issues. And one of the biggest problems that we see with crushed stone trails is vegetation encroachment from the sides and then also from the middle. And if you are having those issues, or if you anticipate having those issues with your trail, we have included some specific maintenance details in the design guide. So if you're looking for strategies to deal with that type of issue, I recommend that you go and look in a little bit more depth into the guide. Lastly, we also get a lot of questions about crushed stone and natural surface trails, specifically about best practices in terms of the size of the aggregate, the amount of compaction, drainage practices, that sort of thing. So we did include a lot more detail this time around in our guide to be able to answer some of those questions from our partners. So if you do have some of those questions, please do go look at the design guide in a little bit more detail. Okay, so our last surface type is boardwalk. In terms of accessibility, not preferred unless the boardwalk has a concrete deck on it. It can be a little bit difficult for people with wheelchairs, and then even for cyclists in terms of the vibration that the seams in between the boards do cause. It is more expensive to build a boardwalk. However, they can be the best solution when you're trying to cross a waterway or a wetland, or if you're building a trail in a flood-prone area. The picture on the right is the Q River Rail Trail, which is how you say it if you aren't good at pronouncing it like I'm not. And this is located in Fall River, Massachusetts. You can actually see here it's a mix of surfaces. You've got the boardwalk in the foreground, and you have the asphalt continuing after that. So using the boardwalk only in places where you really need it to get over a waterway or a wetland, and then utilizing a less costly surface like asphalt where that's applicable as well. Again, in the design guide, we have a lot of details regarding the types of materials used for a boardwalk, the type and specifications for railings, and then also the water clearance that you want to consider when building these types of structures as well. And then really quickly, we're going to go through width and grade specifications that are included in the design guide. For the East Coast Greenway, our goal in working with our partners is to build 12-foot wide trails. This is to accommodate all types of users. It's to reduce user conflicts when passing. So if you can build a 12-foot trail, that's ideal. However, we do follow the AASHTO standards, which require a minimum of a 10-foot wide trail and 11 to 14 feet wide if you anticipate higher user volumes. So you really want to think about the volume of users and the types of users when you're scoping out a project. According to AASHTO, 8 feet is acceptable in very rare circumstances. This is where you have engineering challenges and constraints that you're not able to build something wider. The picture on the right is an example, the American Tobacco Trail, which is right next to the East Coast Greenway headquarters in Durham, North Carolina. Wanted to include this as a great example of a primary hard tread surface. That's actually me on the bike there on the asphalt. And then right next to it, you can see a parallel soft shoulder. If you have the right of way to do it, this is a really great design. The soft parallel shoulder provides a great surface for walkers and runners, and also for equestrians, while also providing a firm and stable surface for cyclists and for people. And lastly, we'll go into the width. Oh, sorry, grade. So for grade, we also follow the AASHTO standards as well, which is a maximum 5% grade. And however, we do want to provide some more examples. So on the right, you'll see the C Street side path in Hyannis, Massachusetts. This is actually just being finalized here. But this is important because side paths, while they should be 5% or less grade, in certain circumstances where they're following the road, the trail grade can match the grade of the adjacent roadway. So this is just a detail where if a side path is your best option, however, your road does have more than a 5% grade, you can build the trail to follow the grade of the roadway. So just so that you're aware of that. Okay, I am going to pass it over to Daniel, who is going to talk about crossings and separated on-road facilities.
Daniel, your line might be muted. Not hearing your audio yet.
Oh, how about that?
All right, we can hear you now.
Thanks. Sorry, crossing wires with the webinar controls and the phone controls. Thanks, Christine. This is Daniel in Philadelphia. I'm talking about crossings and separated on-road facilities. There are two different sections in the design guide, but we're combining these as they relate to points of conflict between users on the trails and users on the road. So really, this is the crux of what makes the trail sort of a legitimate way to get from point A to point B, as you're going to inevitably crossing roadways with vehicular users. So this is extremely important for safety and ensuring the all ages and abilities goal of the East Coast Greenway and similar trails like it. So we have a number of different crossings that we wanted to look at. There's not enough space in the design guide or on this webinar to really go into all the details. So we reference some really well done guidance documents that are already out there, FHWAs, small town rural multimodal networks, you can see on the right. That's got some really helpful guidance on crossings of various sizes and contexts. Also, NACTO just released their own guidebook on intersections. So constantly be checking on these guides. This is very new guidance that is evolving, and the AASHTO standard, while we still follow that, they are still coming up with their newest guide, which should be out hopefully by the end of next year, if not early 2021. But in the meantime, these are definitely great substantial guides for those. So looking at some existing crossings that we have, really what we're dealing with is some major elements that we want to make sure that users of all types are safe, both on the road and on the trail. Those elements are speed, how fast both the vehicles are moving across the trail, but also the trail users themselves. We want to slow everybody down as they approach this point of conflict. The width, specifically of the roadway itself, the right-of-way, the wider the width of the road is shown, speeds will increase. Cars won't feel the need or the urgency or even notice that there's something crossing their path. So we want to make sure that we can basically curtail that to narrow it and slow down the cars. The amount of traffic that's coming by, this will also dictate what type of treatment you'll use. Visibility is incredibly important. So visibility of trail users crossing, visibility of trail users to those driving cars crossing the trail. This can include signage. You can see a number of signs at the crossings in these images to point out to road users that people are crossing the trail. Lighting is really important that we're not showing in this, but when it's dark out, obviously that becomes such a big issue. If you can really light up a crossing, people driving will expect something to be happening there. And then other variables, there's lots of different circumstances where you have unloading and loading, buses that are pulling up, parking can also limit visibility. So making sure that you're looking at every single variable and every user in and around this intersection of a trail. And these trails can cross mid-block, as you see here. So anywhere from sort of a small road that it's crossing where you only might need just some zebra stripes for the crosswalk itself and some signage. If it gets a little bit wider, you can see in New Jersey in the top right, this is parallel to the East Coast Greenway, there's a pedestrian refuge island. So that breaks up the distance that you have to cross. So, if you don't have to worry about both movements, especially on a wider roadway. And then you can change the grade of the road itself, looking down at the WB&A trail on the East Coast Greenway below there, having the crosswalk be raised up so that car users are going to have to slow down before they get onto this basically speed table, encouraging them to look out for users. So in the next slide, we have some more examples of a really wide road. So this is getting out into a more intensive implementation of signage with rapid flashing beacons. You can see above each of those signs. This is a trail crossing in Delaware that crosses a pretty major arterial road. I've been over it a few times, and over each of those signs, once those beacons start flashing, for the majority of the times, cars given enough distance that they see it, they will slow down, and they have yielded, and it's actually worked really well. It also just lets them know that to expect this every time they come through here, that this is a major corridor. It's a major transportation corridor, as if they're crossing another road. Lots of users are starting to use this trail, especially now that it's connected between two cities. So you can see it kind of on the left side, that's from the trail user's angle, and then a little bit diagonal on the right side there. So in the next slide, we've got more robust intersection, basically implementation of signals. So when you have on the left side, that's actually a T intersection on the east side of Newark. This allows the trail users to cross with the pedestrian signal. This is when you really should be stopping traffic entirely with traffic phasing. And on the right side, the next level up is to provide an entire signal phase for the bicycles. You can see the zoom in there on the Hudson River Greenway, Manhattan. You have lots of traffic, lots of users of all types. So providing a separate phase for both walking and biking on a wide enough path there is really important. So again, this is all based on context, and those guides that we refer to have some of those details of what you want to implement and where. Next slide. So in the larger context, these are some newer design techniques. Oakland is not on the East Coast, but this is the closest I had to a protected intersection that I had seen visiting Oakland, having these basically what looks like a slip lane, except it's for a two-way bicycle-only path with the sidewalk next to it. So it forces the vehicular traffic to take a wider turn, so they have to slow down as they turn, and then as they slow down and turn, they're perpendicular to the crossing. Therefore, their vision is much wider. They can see more in their span of vision, and that gives them the ability it forces them basically to see people in front of them. The same is true of the roundabout treatment that you see on the right there. This is on the Greenway in northern Delaware. A roundabout allows, if you have the side path coming up on the right there, it crosses basically at a perpendicular angle instead of at an acute angle. Again, opening up the visibility, slowing down the motorists, and then allowing pedestrians and cyclists to get across. Next, I think we go to separated facilities. So, there's many types of greenways, there's many types of trails, urban, rural. And suburban, and a lot of these contexts, you're not going to always be able to put in a fully built out shared use path. So in those circumstances, we still want to provide traffic separation. So sort of at the very bare minimum, we're going to work our way to a more robust separated facility. But the least kind of what we're working with, that we still evaluate on a case-by-case basis, because context is everything, especially in these urban areas where you have these minimal traffic separation materials. So the top left there is First Street, just north of Union Station in DC. This is actually parallel to the East Coast Greenway, but it would be one that we could consider for designation should other things change on the route there. This has the parking curbs as the horizontal element and the vertical element of the plastic delineators. I've been on this a number of times and seen some of these being beat up over time. So a really important element is how often they're able to be maintained and replaced when they're basically beat up by motorists. Making sure that you have wide enough turning space for larger vehicles at intersections. But also you're not conflicting with other users who are walking and biking there. So looking to the right of that, you can see the next kind of level. You have the plastic delineators still. You have a little bit more buffer space. This is more to the standard of AASHTO, where you have a 2 or 3 foot wide buffer space around that vertical element. And then added onto that are parked cars to the right of that. So you have really a second element of physical protection from that cycle track, basically right there, with still the sidewalk to the left. Going down to the bottom left in New Haven, Connecticut, this kind of shows you what happens when the parked cars aren't there. You can see the spaces for them. This was designated for East Coast Greenway. Again, we still really vet these closely and strictly on how the context is, how often are cars traveling on this roadway, how fast are they going, so that this might not necessarily always get designated, but in this case we considered it safe enough to be designated, and we'll continue to evaluate that as things develop and change in areas. So this shows again vertical separators, and then parked cars that currently aren't there but will be there at times. And then there is a second, there's a walking path that's kind of out of view of the photo, parallel to the road, to the cycle track on the left side. So it's important that we still have both biking and walking. Finally, more robust in DC on the bottom right there, you have a cycle track with curb protection, with a barrier that's probably a few feet, 2.5 feet wide, that's built up so that cars can actually feel it if they bump into it. This is, again, more expensive, but very important for protecting the cyclists, and then again still a walkway on the left. So going up in scale, the next slide. So we have, again, these are still pretty constrained environments. We had a question about how are we able to get space for these movements and to provide protection. That's been the case in every city that I've seen in the Mid-Atlantic region. This is in Philadelphia on the top left. That's the Frankford Creek Greenway that connects to the East Coast Greenway. This is raised up the bike users with pedestrians so that they're sharing this space. This is just like everything else in here, very contextual. How many pedestrians do you expect to see? How many cyclists do you expect to see? Is that enough space for the daily traffic? In this case, it is. This is not a sort of high traffic area in a downtown setting, but more in a outlying neighborhood. So the city was able to raise it up, and they have a very narrow buffer, but it does have some trees along there. The city of Philadelphia is able to maintain this and kind of vouch for this design. I think it is, a lot of these are on state roads, so you have to kind of negotiate with that type of, the design standards that you're up against. So context, there is some flexibility to experiment with some of these and always reevaluate over and over to make sure that it's still working and up to standard. On the right side is another example of shared use, biking and walking, again, separated out with markings to help people understand to expect bikes here, but also, some extra signage is really helpful to tell, users who are on bikes to slow down, to call out, to be basically yielding to all pedestrians, because you're still going to have very slow users on this path. So none of these are to be sort of throughways for, you know, the spandex-clad warriors. Like this is still very much contextual to that, and so signage should dictate likewise. The bottom two are really interesting takes and sort of more, you know, newer and still kind of experimenting with these, separating out bike and pedestrian movements. So on the bottom left there is in DC. This is Main Avenue. You have a cycle track that's closest to the road. There's still, you know, a buffer with a curb protecting you from traffic and parked cars. Then you have a median of planting vegetation in the middle that has some green stormwater elements to it, and then a walkway closest to the retail frontage. So all of that, you know, separates the users, but, you know, reality is people are going to walk onto the bike path. People are going to be delivering goods onto the bike path. So they're still looking at this, still trying to figure out what's the best way to mix. Basically, again, it's an urban environment. Cyclists should be slowing down. And this is not a speedway, but, you know, the bottom line is safety for all. So working with the local authorities on this is really critical. And then on the right side, you can see there's a little bit more movement between, more fluidity between the biking and walking movements. This is in Philadelphia along the Delaware River Trail. So I think next slide is elements. Oh, no, looking at some of the design guides that are out there that really get into the nitty gritty, the width, the spacing, the curb, angles of all these. Some of the top guides are from FHA with the bikeway selection guide, separated bike lane design guide, and then at the state level, MassDOT has produced separated bike lane guide that's really gets into a lot of these in their graphics. You can see in the cover photo, just protected intersections, like trying to break down all these elements in a way that's really visual and jumps out at you, so you're not just lost in design kind of rhetoric. And I think the next one is the elements. Yeah, so from the from the FHWA Bikeway Selection Guide, these are really important to consider because you're getting stuck in the trees, you want to look at the forest. It's so important to ensure that these are helpful and useful routes, that they're direct, that they're getting people where they need to go. They're connected within a network and actually working in parallel with other, you know, transit, something that complements biking and walking really well. You're getting to transit stations, you're getting into retail, you're getting into education, public health. You're connecting all those nodes with, you know, residences so that people can use this as a legitimate form of transportation. And people likewise want to do that if it's comfortable, if it's attractive, if they don't have to stop at every, you know, every crosswalk or every mid-block crossing that has, you know, too much traffic. You need to really ensure that that there is unbroken flow, that this is convenient and intuitive to people. I think that maybe one more. Oh, so I'm going to hand it over to Bruce in Connecticut to talk about bridges and signage.
Hello, everybody. It's good to be here. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to talk about bridges, and these engineered structures generally follow AASHTO and NACTO guidance, minimum of 8 feet, although they're almost all being built at 10, 12, 14 feet these days, with a minimum weight that they can hold, so that in many cases you can get an emergency vehicle over them, for instance. It's critical for safe and direct paths for bicyclists and pedestrians. There's a safety issue. You want to bypass dangerous or impracticable at-grade crossings. And you know, we would argue that this connectivity issue, which Daniel talked about in good detail, and I don't really have to go too far, but this is critical. And what happens is oftentimes these end up being gaps because they're hard to build and they're expensive. So that cost really can be flipped into safety, equity, environmental issues, economic issues, and there's a real genuine argument that the benefits of these projects outweigh the costs. And obviously you're creating iconic structures as a legacy, and I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that were just recently completed. So next. Here's one of them. This is the Route 6 Bridge in Farmington, Connecticut, my hometown. I've been working for, I think, 18 years to get this built. And it's 117 feet long, 12 feet wide, cost $1.5 million, and it was built on the existing railroad right-of-way. So those old railroad embankments made it arguably much easier to build. Note that this is a stunning example of railroad derivative design. That is a tied arch structure that was lifted into place, shipped in two pieces, lifted into place at midnight. They closed the highway. And then you can see bottom right, it was poured in place as well. So that concrete piece was actually poured in place. Next. So, at-grade crossings should be looked at first, where possible, as they are simply easier and cheaper to build. Now, there are certain instances where you simply can't. That last example we saw and the one coming up, it would be impossible to cross those roads. But they particularly help users with mobility issues, and they add safe passage to people who are going to cross there anyway. So formalizing bike ped crossings that people would still use really makes a lot of sense. But if they're not going to use them, if they can't use them, if it has to be engineered, then we need these bridges. Next. All right, this is interesting. This was just recently completed over a major highway. This is a year old on the Hot River Trail. There was no railroad right-of-way, so this is all new. This is a geosynthetic reinforced soil integrated bridge system. And don't ask me to say it again, but if you want more information on this, because it's a fascinating thing, go to FHWA's website, and they've got a lot of information on this. This is the longest one in the United States, at 122 feet long. Again, shipped in two pieces, lifted into place. Note that the bridge itself cost $1.7 million, but the total project cost was $3.1 million. And when we go back to what Christine was commenting on, this all new construction versus at grade costs a lot of money. So if you're looking at a per mile rate, this is kind of hard to swallow. Having said that, this was a major gap in this Hot River Trail system, and Connecticut DOT decided that they were going to spend the money to literally bridge this gap. Next. So, redesigned bridges. Wherever possible, we need to get into early negotiations with our DOTs, with our MPOs, with all the people that are working on these projects to influence outcomes. This is a great example of that. This is the redesign of the Scudder Falls Bridge over I-295 from Pennsylvania to New Jersey. Note the DNR Canal towpath on the right. Note the Delaware Canal towpath on the left. This is a major connector, and this is a major victory. And this is going to be happening. I don't think they've actually started construction yet, but this is a great example of what we need to be doing as advocates to move forward projects for connectivity when we redesign our crossings. Next. Okay, now I'm on to signage. So wayfinding signage. This is our current signs on the left. We want to make sure people know they're on the East Coast Greenway. We want to brand ourselves as East Coast Greenway. We want to identify route direction changes. And basically, we want this sign. This is our new sign, 5.5 by 15 inches. It is easy to see. The arrows are 5.5 by 5.5. They're easier to see. Note the black outline that's fairly new. And for more information, there's a Greenway signage manual, greenway.org/signage-manual. And you can get a lot more information on our signage, where to put it, pending, of course, permission from on where it is. Next. So, non-standard wayfinding signs. We actually saw this sign in one of Daniel's slides. This is a Liberty Water Gap Trail in Newark. Note the multiple jurisdictions, the seal of the city, Liberty Water Gap, East Coast Greenway, and then a wayfinding arrow. And on the right, we get a lot of jurisdictions, in some cases whole states, that want us to use the MUTCD bike signage. So the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, Chapter 9, gives us what we need to use. The large one on road is 18 by 18. The one on greenways is 12 by 12. They have corresponding arrows. These signs are either green on white or white on green. Next. Other signage. To your left, we've got you are here mileage. This is a one-off that we did a number of years ago for kiosks along the Greenway, and it shows you exactly where you are in terms of mileage on our 3,000-mile trip. Billboard signs, which you see in the middle, generally you see in state parks or county parks, and this is a good example. Carolina Forest Bike and Run Park. And on the right, we've got a kiosk. We have a number of kiosks in the system. This one happens to be in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And in fact, we're putting a new one up in Princeton very soon. Note the information material, note the signage, and these are very critical for people to wayfind in our system. Last one. So we kind of come full circle here. This is signs denoting bridges. And again, we want to brand as much as possible. And as much as possible, we want as many people to see this branding. And so these two are great examples. The one on top there is the bridge I just showed you. That brutalist design that's so cool looking. We got the East Coast Greenway signs on that. And then below that, we've got that iconic bridge over I-40 in Durham on the American Tobacco Trail. And do note that you note these are brown backed. This is, again, MUTCD standard, and they have to be improved and installed by maintenance personnel or the original contractors in the case of the bridge above. And that's it. I'm going to send you on to Brent. Thank you.
Greetings from Savannah, Georgia, everyone. As we've seen throughout the presentation, there are such a wide variety of contexts and environments that the East Coast Greenway routes through from Maine all the way down to Key West. So an exciting new direction that the Alliance is taking is this brand new effort to acknowledge that in some very rare and specific and carefully vetted circumstances, we may be willing to designate certain on-road sections that connect pieces of trail that are already on the ground. And this is very different from what Daniel talked about with our on-road infrastructure. We're not talking about separated bike lanes or cycle tracks. We're talking now about actually permanently designating potentially sections that are technically on-road, open to motor vehicles, but with a lot of very specific criteria. Those include, it's got to, number one, be safe, and it's got to be a low-stress environment that is effectively the equivalent as a user experience to being on a traffic-separated trail. And the way we're going to judge that is, what are the number of cars? There need to be very, very few cars, an extremely low ADT. They need to be traveling at a very low rate of speed, 20 miles per hour or less, posted speed limit. These need to be short distance connections, and there need to be signage and pavement markers indicating the preference and priority presence of people walking and bicycling and otherwise moving in a non-motorized way. So I want to stop real quick and just emphasize, really underscore for everyone that we have not yet designated a single on-road exception. So these three images I'm going to show you were crowdsourced generated by my fellow regional coordinators of potential places where we might consider this exception. So I just want to make sure that's really clear to people that we have not actually approved anything as of today through this on-road designation exception process. So this first example is Crow's Nest Road in Baltimore, Maryland, and is a short connector for the Jones Fall Trail. There really is no through traffic. It's quiet. There's almost no motor vehicle traffic whatsoever. You see a sign there that indicates share the road. And importantly, in a lot of these cases, part of the context is that we don't know of or expect medium or long-term any plans to build a separated trail or a separated on-road facility. So if we want this to be designated, we may need to consider looking at it as it is now. And again, just want to really underscore and emphasize it's got to be safe and a low stress environment that is basically the equivalent of a Greenway experience for its users. Next slide. So here's a second example from Philadelphia, Harley Avenue, going to the Bartram's Garden driveway entrance. It's extremely low speed. You can see that the posted speed limit is 15 miles per hour. There is effectively no motor vehicle traffic in the first place. Up on the right, kind of midway in the mid-ground, you can see a share the road sign. And also another consideration is we've got really good line of sight. You know, it's pretty shady, but you've got a really good line of sight in terms of how straight and flat that this street is. And so this is the kind of connection potentially that we would consider for permanent designation with ongoing review by staff and our volunteers and state committee members. Next image, please. And then lastly, this is a pretty unique example recommended by Christine, my counterpart from Maine, from Scarborough, Maine. This is the Eastern Road, which has advisory bike lanes. That's what those dashed lines are. They look like they're kind of designating a shoulder or a bike lane. And this road doesn't really serve any through traffic whatsoever. There is trail both behind you as the photographer and up ahead of you after this short stretch of road. There are no long-term plans to create a trail along this corridor. And what's expected in this advisory bike lane situation, as you can see by the informative sign there, is motorists are expected to use the central lane. So if in the rare case that you had two cars coming towards each other, they would both carefully move over to the right, you know, watching, of course, for people on foot and people on bicycles in that advisory bike lane, pass each other, and then resume in their respective directions of travel back in the central lane. So again, this is the kind of situation, along with the previous two examples, that we will at least consider now for permanent designation, and it's going to require a much more robust review and inspection process than we even have for our traffic separated greenways and trails that we designate currently. That's it for this section, so I believe we're now opening it up for questions.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. We have received some really excellent questions from the audience. And just a reminder, if you are on the line and want to ask a question, feel free to type in the chat box and we'll try to get to them. But we'll go ahead and dig into a few that have come in. Many of the questions so far appear to be falling into a few different categories around user experience, funding, and different design considerations. So we'll try to answer at least one from each of these areas. So first question is, from a Greenway user perspective, what sort of amenities should communities be thinking about to help ensure easy access and equitable use?
This is Bruce. I can take that on. Having funded many of them over the years, I think that amenities break down to, well, first of all, partly in the design phase, parking, lights, landscaping, fencing. You don't necessarily think of those as amenities, but they are. And more those are, that's happening, being delineated in the design phase. But in particular, what I think of as amenities are information kiosks, kind of, you know, 4 to 18 grand for a kiosk. Benches, somewhere around $1,000. Fix-it stations, if you want to look them up, a good manufacturer is Dero, D-E-R-O. They cost around $1,000, $1,200. And water fountains, Again, if you want to look them up, Murdoch is a good corporation. We've used those in the past. And installed, they're about $15,000. So this stuff isn't cheap. But again, it makes a community better. You need to have that community buy-in. You need to have dedicated maintenance. So whoever is actually maintaining this section of trail has to buy in to this. And number one, the number one thing that I get is bathrooms. And the easiest solution is seasonal porta potties under contract. We have many, many of those across the system. But more and more, we're seeing in new construction phases specified toilets being put in. There's a set in Connecticut near me of solar-powered self-composting units that are fantastic. But again, you've got to have the buy-in from the local municipality or whoever's running it, state parks, whoever it is, to actually maintain those. And then finally, I would add that all this stuff shouldn't just be one-off. You need to have a unified design plan so that, particularly if you're branding a trail, I can speak to the Farmington Canal Heritage Trail in central Connecticut, that the bench design, for instance, is mandatory in all the towns. So you won't see different benches, for instance. And you can tell I can go on, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Bruce. A question come in around funding. The question is, could you recommend some strategies for communities that want to build the trail, the East Coast Greenway, or just a trail period, but maybe have less resources, have cost constraints, are not able yet to hire an outside consultant, for example?
This is Christine. I can answer that. So the East Coast Greenway Alliance, we work with various trail organizations, municipalities, and volunteers up and down our corridor. And oftentimes funding is the issue that holds up the project development process and construction of these trails. One of the goals of our new design guide, as I talked about during my section, is to provide as many specifications and best practices to empower our partners with resources that they otherwise might not have. So one way that we suggest moving the project development process forward is to work with local and regional planners and engineers, as well as your Department of Public Works that might be able to provide some planning, design, and construction services in-house. This is especially useful in cases where you have a relatively straightforward corridor and project. This strategy will save money on the front end and will allow you to move the projects through the development process faster without having to come up with large sums of money to hire consultants for each step along the way. We realize that not every community has the resources to do this in-house, but every community does have a regional planning agency or commission that can typically perform more affordable feasibility studies, and local town or city engineers that can often do cost estimating and some preliminary design work that will get you further ahead in the process. I can give you one example. Yesterday, I was working with a trail organization in Maine who has worked with a former DPW director to build one of their sections of trail. Basically, they were able to raise the money on their own as the trail organization for the materials, and he volunteered his expertise and time to actually construct the trail. So a lot of times if you're working on a more complicated project, it's going to cost more money, there are bridges, all kinds of stuff. You do have to stick with the traditional project development process, and it is going to cost money to do the feasibility, to do the different engineering phases, and to do the design. However, if you have something that's relatively straightforward, and you do have a city engineer or a town engineer that can lend some of their time to these projects, or you need a basic feasibility study done, if you have a regional planning commission, for example, you can actually hire them at a much lower rate to do the feasibility study, and that'll get you one step ahead, and it likely will not cost as much as if you hired an outside consultant. So those are just some things to consider. Again, these are for very straightforward projects, but if you can do anything in-house in your community or in your region to tick off some of these project development steps, it'll get you closer to construction, and then you can worry about applying for bigger grants and hiring outside consultants for the more complicated and costly steps of the process.
Thanks, Christine. We had a question come in related to signage. And to clarify, what is the difference between the signed East Coast Greenway travel route and the permanently designated Greenway? These aren't always the same thing, right? Question mark.
This is V. I'll take that. Bruce mentioned a little bit more about signage earlier. The primary purpose of that being to establish a unique brand and inform users that they are on the East Coast Greenway. Now, for a lot of what you might see on our map.greenway.org resource is our interim travel route. Now, this will be routing that for the East Coast Greenway will be replaced in the future by our permanent Greenway route. Now, that's what we have been talking about as our standards. So this particular route, our envision route, will be more appropriate for inclusion in the East Coast Greenway. So what we have right now for that public interim route might have signage so that we can help for proper wayfinding for our users now. But that will be a little bit different, or could be a little bit different than our permanent Greenway route, which is developed by the East Coast Greenway State Committees and is intended to also be signed to aid in the navigating of that as well as that current interim travel route. Hope that helps.
Yes, thanks, V. Question around design considerations, particularly in urban areas. Question is around, could we share a couple more examples related to constrained rights of way, perhaps in an urban area or a city, and how that particular city or cities have gotten around that challenge of constraints with right of way to add biking and walking facilities?
Yeah, this is Daniel. I can speak to that a little bit. So this is an issue that comes up over and over. Obviously, our urban areas have constrained lane widths everywhere. You're dealing with many folks who are already saying that we need to widen the lanes and go in a different direction, but we've seen over and over that only brings more traffic. So I think underscoring all of these in the first place is advocacy, and at the heart of it, you have to push the paradigm, and this you can see over the last 10 years, the last 20 years in the US has totally changed. And if you look to other countries, if you look to Europe, South America, there's other examples of cities that have done this decades before us. So really it's bringing in that context that, roads are subject to change and have always been. But then getting to the nitty gritty, there are ways to basically request experimental design through the MUTCD process. Cities have done this. I would say DC is a really good one to look at. DDOT as basically working within constrained environments, responding to, as many cities are, unfortunately, a rise, a spike in bicycle and pedestrian deaths. And a lot of that urgency is now manifesting itself in designs in constrained areas. There's a protected bike lane that wasn't previously protected down in Southwest DC. They put up delineators, and that's debatable about whether is that up to standard or not. And then it's debatable, okay, is this safer than it was before? I think subjectively, anecdotally, it looks like it is, but the only way to really know that is to evaluate it, really scrutinize how is this affecting traffic? How is it affecting users? Is it pinching cyclists in a narrow width and they're actually more uncomfortable, or are they actually, do they feel safer, and are they able to easily get out of the lane if they need to? So all this comes down to looking at examples, and I would also suggest that not just searching kind of far and wide, but reaching out to the East Coast Greenway Alliance, especially if you're dealing with East Coast cities. We have tons and tons of examples and contacts who help design those, and can go to bat for those if a certain town or city needs those examples or needs to talk to someone to help basically be persuaded that there are other ways. You don't always have to have this huge buffer of space. You can sometimes raise bike lanes to be at the sidewalk grade and have a curb if there's slow enough roadway speeds. There are exceptions to the rule, to almost every rule. So, it's a combination of things, but ultimately you have to have the support of people on the ground who use this to help push politicians so that they feel that, okay, we're going to try out this new design standard, because otherwise, it might fall in on itself and then create a bad example that people will point to for a long time. So making sure that you have a holistic approach is really key.
Thanks, Daniel. And thanks to everyone for joining. We are now a little bit over the hour mark, and I wanted to make sure we had time to talk about the process that the Alliance is going to take for updating the guide. So V, could you just talk a little bit about the process we're going to take for updates and additions and feedback?
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. Last but not least, the guide update process. This will actually include annual updates to the document. We will be doing a big push for comments prior to that update. So at this time, we're looking at the next scheduled update to happen next year, late in the fall of 2020. We also will have a big public comment period kicking off early in the fall of next year. Now, part of this update will include some of the newest research available, guidance in many of the areas affecting the planning, design, and operations of trails. You heard Daniel talk about this earlier, but should the upcoming update to the AASHTO's guide for the development of bicycle facilities be available, that is a perfect example of what we would include on that update. We also will be including all of the feedback and comments we've received from our partners so far. Now, we've been capturing feedback received to date for the inclusion in the next update, such as any questions that we've gotten from partners via email, on social media. We've been collecting that, and we will continue to collect on an ongoing basis through both our website and anything we receive by our staff as well. Now, on the website, we have the design guide feedback form at the very bottom of the greenway.org/design guide page. So you can submit any feedback on that website using that form at any time. We are a lean organization, so that's a big reason for having an annual update instead of just updating whenever we get feedback. We've gotten a lot of great feedback, so if we were to update every single time, we just unfortunately lack the capacity for that. So if you or anybody has any additional feedback that you haven't submitted already, feel free to forward them along our website feedback form there. And that's it on my end. Thank you all for being such engaged participants today. And here, let me send it back to Niles to bring it to a close.
Thanks, V, and I just wanted to echo the thanks for joining today's webinar, and I'd like to thank our presenters and my colleagues, Christine, Bruce, Daniel, Sarah, Brent, V. Really appreciate the presentations y'all gave today, and I hope this has been very helpful for folks that are interested in building and developing and working with us on the East Coast Greenway. Please write to us, call us, email us if we can ever answer any questions or you want to get involved. And thanks everyone again. Look forward to talking with everyone again soon. Bye.